Hello learners, this video talks about the functions of the ecosystem. So let us begin with what are the functions of the ecosystem. So basically the functions of ecosystem are physical, biological and geochemical processes that are occurring in the ecosystem, and these functions are related to the structural components of an ecosystem. And what are the structural components of ecosystem? The biotic as well as the abiotic, and how all of these biotic and abiotic factors are interacting with each other within the ecosystem and across different ecosystems. And the second function is that every ecosystem performs under natural conditions in a systematic way. So there is always a process for each function to happen. And next is it receives energy from the sun and it passes on through the various biotic components. As you all know that all life on earth depends upon this flow of energy, and besides energy there are various nutrients also, as well as water, that is constantly being exchanged by the biotic components within themselves and with the biotic components within the same ecosystem and with the other different ecosystems. I'm sure you all are well aware right now about the structural as well as the functional aspects of ecosystem. The structural aspects are composed of biotic and abiotic components. Biotic components, you all know what they are, and abiotic components consists of all the inorganic substances that are constantly being cycled through the ecosystem, the organic compounds, edaphic factors like factors related to your soil, and the meteorological factors, that are all the factors like temperature, climate, humidity, moisture, sunlight, rainfall, etc. And the functional aspect is everything that the structural aspect is actually doing in the ecosystem. And the main and the most important of the functional aspect is your food chains and food webs. And through these food chain and food web there is a constant energy flow. There is also a nutrient cycling going on through the ecosystem, as well as a regulation and stability of the ecosystem through all of these processes. And there is something called ecosystem services also. Ecosystem services are all the various services that the ecosystem provides us with. For example, a single tree, it provides us with a lot of useful products as well as shelter, absorption of CO2. So those are all the ecosystem services that a tree is providing us, and we'll also learn about all of these in our subsequent lectures. So moving on to the main ecological functions, as I've already discussed. The first one is food chain and food webs, second is energy flow, third is nutrient cycling, and finally your ecosystem processes. So we'll firstly begin with the food chain and food web concept. The food chain is any flow of energy that is mediated through a series of feeding relationships, and that is in a definite sequence, starting from your primary producers to your primary consumers, and then secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and it goes on. The second important factor of the food chain is that nutrients also move along this food chain, and thus this nutrient flows from the first trophic level to the higher trophic levels, and all organisms, living or dead, are potential food for some other organism, and thus there is no wastage in the functioning of a natural ecosystem. An example of your common food chain is a grass being eaten by grasshopper, which is being eaten by frog is being eaten by snake, and which is subsequently being devoured by a hawk. So this is an example of a grassland. Similarly, in a pond ecosystem also, the basis is formed by phytoplanktons, which is being had by zooplanktons, and successively it goes on till the largest fish has devoured its prey. And each level of of a food chain is known as a trophic level. So a trophic level actually shows you the designation or the nutritional status of a particular organism. And in each trophic level, some energy is being lost as heat and respiratory losses. Thus, there is a net decrease in energy moving away from the first trophic level to the higher trophic levels. Therefore, trophic levels are always limited in a food chain. The first trophic level in a food chain is always your producers or your plants, green plants. And the second is your herbivores, which are called the primary consumers. And the second or the second secondary consumers, which is also called the first order carnivores. They are the small carnivores, for example, your lizards, frogs, snakes, and crabs, which are in turn being had by your second order carnivores or your tertiary consumers, which could be your eagles or tigers, whales, crocodiles, etc. Now, types of food chain, and this is very important. There are basic two types of food chain. The first one is your regular food chain, the grazing food chain, where it starts with a green plant and ends up in a consumer. And examples, as you all are well aware by now, so I'm not going through that. And then there's a detritus food chain. That is the second type of food chain. Detritus food chain starts with dead and decaying organic matter. So it does not start with green plants. So the moment an organism in a regular grazing food chain dies, the detritus food chain begins there. The detritus food chains are commonly found in forest floors, in salt marshes, as well as in deep ocean vents. Some examples are, for example, leaf litter is being decomposed by bacteria. Bacteria are in turn eaten by protozoa. Protozoa could be had by small fish, and small fish can again be had by a large fish. So this is an example of your detritus food chain. Food chains maintain balance in the entire ecosystem through the feeding relationships, and food chains also keep a check on the population size of organisms. You can well imagine what um, the removal of a single species would lead to in an ecosystem. For example, grasses are removed from an ecosystem, that will wipe out the entire herbivore population from that ecosystem. The next important characteristic of a food web is that they also exhibit the property of biomagnification. Biomagnification is the increase in the concentration of pollutants in each trophic level. So these pollutants could be chemicals, heavy metals, pesticides, which are either slowly degradable or non-degradable. And as they enter the food chain in low concentrations, they tend to accumulate at each trophic level, and thus their concentration increases with an increasing trophic level. So that is how the topmost trophic levels are the worst affected due to the high accumulation of chemicals. A food web is a network of interwoven food chains with various producers, consumers, and decomposers which are operating simultaneously at each trophic level. So, there are a number of options of prey as well as predators for a single species in a food web. And food webs are also of three types, which is given by Robert Payne. Robert Payne is the famous person who gave us the concept of keystone species, which we'll talk about in some other lecture. So the first type of your food web is the connectedness web. So the connectedness web shows the feeding relationship amongst organisms. Then the second type is your energy flow web. And energy flow web shows us the connection between the organisms and the energy flux. Energy flux is the amount of energy that is being transferred between organisms. Is it high, is it low? So that is what your energy flow web shows. And the third one is your functional web. The functional web shows us the influence of a particular species population on the growth rates of other species population. So all of these types of food webs were studied by him in an estuarine ecosystem, and that is how these came about.